Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. I thought I'd start off this week's episode by, well, that's the thing about Conan Exiles. When you're building stuff, and this game is rapidly turning into Minecraft with axes, there's not really enough going on to justify a video, so I thought I'd just save some highlights of what I've been getting up to show off in Mingles with Jingles. That rock formation over there is where I'm going to build my next thing. As you can see, I've already started laying some sandstone foundations down over there. Unlike my previous, what's the right word? I was going to say excavation, but no, that's not it. Construction project? Yeah. This place isn't actually intended to be practical, just pretty. Whereas my previous construction project was intended to be built for maximum defensive value. This is just, well, it's just supposed to be pretty. So I've taken various different sections of video footage throughout the construction process, so you get an idea of where it came from and how it's ending up. So as you can see here, I've laid most of the foundations. The idea is to basically entirely cover up that rock pinnacle with construction. There's mostly going to be absolutely nothing inside this palace, I suppose you'd call it. It's mostly just going to be solid rock, with just enough space inside for a staircase. Well, you know, it keeps me busy. It keeps me off the streets. I mean, what have you been doing this week? I've also been playing an awful lot Jurassic World Evolution, but that's an entirely different story. What you're looking at here is untold hours of mining rocks, I suppose quarrying rocks is the correct term, mining iron and chopping down trees, over and over and over, for days, if necessary, and trust me, it was necessary, in order to produce even just these basic sandstone foundation blocks. And then, once I'm sure that it's all correct, and it's actually going to do the job, you do it all again, and resurface everything with stone brick rather than basic sandstone, because, well, basic sandstone does look a bit crap, and this place is supposed to look pretty. So yeah, that's a lot of digging and chopping. Can you tell I've been bored this week? Well, anyway, it's not quite complete, but it's almost there. There are still some of the sandstone blocks that need to be surfaced off with stone brick. But yeah, this is basically what I've spent almost the entire week doing, at least until I got myself a hold of Jurassic World Evolution, and then I sort of basically did exactly the same thing, except in tropical islands with dinosaurs, which was the subject of this week's Casual Saturday video, and that is a lot of fun. I wonder if I could extend everything and do a second tower covering that up. Oh no, that's at least another 3 days effort. Jingles, learn to be satisfied with what you have. Let's take another look, because I've also built a sort of private beach over here. Yep, there it is. Very exclusive, I'm sure you'll agree. And again, at this stage, it's not even... well, it's about 80% complete. It's still mostly just sandstone foundations, and not all of the rock pinnacle is covered up on this side. But as you can see, it's coming along quite nicely. I've still probably got about another 2 days of effort before I can consider it to be complete. And about 4 or 5 days later, which just goes to prove that it's a good job I never took work as a quantity surveyor, it's around about 99% complete. I still haven't stuck up any decorations. There's some rough edges that need to be smoothed off, and there are still a couple of sandstone blocks in place where I'd like there to be stone brick, but mostly, all bar the finishing efforts, it's pretty much done. And the overwhelming majority of the interior is just solid rock. Remember, I built this over a mountain. In fact, what I've basically done is give a mountain a facelift, turn it into something that looks like a building. But the interior, with the exception of a couple of staircases, is mostly solid rock. Hey, at least it kept me off the streets. It gave me something to do for a week. Anyway, what's next? Oh, that reminds me. The amazingly talented Sammy Hallam, and yeah, you can probably consider this part of Mingles with Jingles an advert, has been hard at work on a new product lineup for the merchandising store in association with Teespring. All sorts of new stuff, Jingles Minion and Jingles Salt Mine hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, you name it, now available for purchase. I really can't thank Sammy enough for all the work that he does here. For those of you who don't know who Sammy is, he's basically responsible for all of the art that you see here on my YouTube channel. And he's also done some commissions for the Tank Museum, the David Fletcher Tank Chats t-shirts that you can buy in the Tank Museum gift shop of his work as well. And Sammy's been hard at work with a new product lineup for the Salt Mine shop. Now, bear in mind, there are two separate Teespring The Mighty Jingles Salt Mine stores, one for the EU and one for the US. So, bear that in mind when you're choosing, should you decide to purchase something, bear that in mind when you're choosing which one you order from. If you're in the EU and you order from the US, you will pay increased shipping charges. This is the US store. In the US store, they do have one product that's not available in the EU store. Don't ask me why, because reasons. The Mighty Jingles Howdy Folks pillow. Yes, if you want to sleep with the Mighty Jingles, let's face it, who wouldn't? You can order yourself a pillow with the Jingles Minion on one side and Howdy Folks on the other. Only available from the North American store, however. Again, I'm not entirely sure why. You can order them from the EU, but you will pay increased postage. Links down below in the video description to both the EU and the North American storefronts. And remember, 75% of the profits goes directly to Sammy himself, because basically he's the one doing all the hard work. So, help out a struggling artist. Order your Mighty Jingles merchandise today. And thus ends the advert, because basically that's what it is, in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Coming up next, thanks to the wonders of the internet, we're going to travel back in time, 6 years to the year 2012.
Hi folks, welcome back to my World of Tanks replays. Once again, we're in the Lorraine 40T, a lovely French Tier 8 medium tank. I think this match was shortly after I'd unlocked the top engine for it, and as you'll see, this thing can...
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to 2012. The Lorraine 40T was a French Tier 8 medium tank. There was no such thing as physics. You couldn't shoot through objects. The matchmaking was absolutely horrific. This is a Tier 8 medium tank. I'm going to be fighting Tier 5 heavies. What's the point of this, Jingles? Well, I thought it was worthwhile showing you what World of Tanks was like 6 years ago. And the reason for that is because of the two World of Tanks videos that I uploaded this week, Carnage and Big Numbers. Circumflexes in big numbers, scoring the most damage, as far as we can tell, anybody has ever managed to score in a Sherman Firefly. And in the Carnage videos, two World of Tanks replays that for the first time in living memory, or, well, in a very long time indeed, actually got me excited. So much so that I was quite literally sitting on the edge of my seat, jumping up and down in anticipation to see what was going to happen. And I can't remember that happening for a long time, watching a World of Tanks replay. As I was uploading each video, I can clearly remember thinking, they're going to love this. And yet, while the videos were quite popular, I mean, I'm sitting here right now looking at the stats, and the Circumflex's Big Numbers video has reached 93,000 views, it's got 5,668 likes, but it's also got 84 dislikes. Now, that might not seem like a lot, and I've got to keep things in perspective here, it isn't, but the Carnage video has 118,000 views, 6,687 likes, and 109 dislikes. Now, disclaimer, these are probably going to sound like first world problems, but if I put a video up and it gets more than 100 dislikes, and the Carnage video got more than 100, and the Big Numbers video is approaching 100, that starts sending alarm bells ringing. And again, you know, I realise 6,600 likes to 108 dislikes is a pretty strong ratio, but at the same time it's more than 100 dislikes, and that doesn't happen very often whenever I upload a video. And I really couldn't understand it, because I think it's one of the best World of Tanks videos, the Carnage video. One of the best World of Tanks videos I've uploaded in months. So I started paying closer than usual attention to the comments. And wow. Some of you guys are incredibly hard to please. Now, I am kind of getting used to this whenever I'm going through the comments of a World of Tanks video, because they seem to be turning into an extension of the official World of Tanks forums. People just seem to use the comments section of my World of Tanks videos to vent their displeasure over wargaming in general and World of Tanks in particular. And you know, that's fine. At one level, that's exactly what the comments section of a World of Tanks video is for. And now, before we go any further, I'm not trying to say that World of Tanks is a perfect game. Far from it. I mean, the game has issues. I know it, you know it, everybody knows it. The 357 matchmaker is less than popular. There are issues with premium ammunition, premium consumables, the idea that in a free-to-play game you can spend money and buy yourself a combat advantage in this day and age. Well, yeah. The game has its issues, but at the same time, I thought it was worth having a bit of a retrospective, because it has definitely improved. Now, you may disagree, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but just because it's your opinion doesn't mean that it's right, and I'm going to present the evidence to back up my statement. And I'm not just talking about the graphics. This is World of Tanks 6 years ago running on the highest possible graphics settings, and it looks like World of Tanks now running on the lowest possible graphics settings. But this is just eye candy. None of this is... I mean, it adds to the immersion, but it doesn't actually change the way the game plays much, if at all. There are plenty of other things that have changed in World of Tanks over the course of 6 years that have added to and improved the way the game plays. Physics, for one thing. Back in 2012, your tanks were basically welded to the ground. It was impossible for them to flip. And their agility and maneuverability wasn't really affected by the terrain nearly as much as it is today. Now, you could argue that this is a good thing, but the lack of physics is the reason why tanks like the T-50-2 are no longer in World of Tanks PC. You can still play it in World of Tanks, I can't remember if it's console or Blitz, but not on PC. The reason why the T-50-2 was so ridiculously overpowered 6 years ago was because it could travel at 72 kilometers per hour and it stayed welded to the ground at all times. If they introduced that brokenly overpowered tank back into the game today, it would probably be terrible, because it would just flip over the second you tried to take a corner at speed. Something that never used to happen in World of Tanks 6 years ago because there was no physics in the game. Then you have the issue of shell penetration, and I'm not talking about armour penetration here. It was not at all uncommon to find situations where you could be in a tank with a 100mm gun firing armour-piercing shells and it would not be able to penetrate a wooden shack in order to hit a tank on the other side. You couldn't shoot through objects at all in the way that you would expect large caliber armour-piercing ammunition to be able to do. You could drive through some objects, but you couldn't shoot through them and hit a tank on the other side. Premium ammunition was only available for real money. You couldn't buy it with in-game credits at all. So if you were firing premium ammunition or somebody was firing it at you, somebody involved in that engagement had put their hand in their pocket in order to be able to afford the privilege. Now, you could on one hand argue that this wasn't actually such a bad thing. You see, when wargaming introduced the ability to buy premium consumables and ammunition for in-game credits, it made it more affordable for the masses, or for people who play a lot of World of Tanks, to be able to amass the credits required to regularly resupply their premium ammunition without having to actually pay for it. Of course, the flip side of that is that it made premium ammunition a lot more common. So I'm not entirely sure whether or not that's a good thing. At the same time, though, way back then, you really did kind of need premium ammunition a lot more than you do today. And that's because of the matchmaking in World of Tanks. Now, I realise that there are problems with the current matchmaker. The 357 matchmaker in particular, where you have 3 top-tier tanks, 5 mid-tier tanks and 7 bottom-tier tanks. It means a lot of those bottom-tier tanks are getting into games with tanks 2 tiers higher than them. And at tier 8 in particular, the tier 8 tanks very, very rarely see anything other than 357 matchmaker battles, so they're more often than not getting into fights with tanks 2 tiers higher than them. But unpopular though the current matchmaker may be, and I'm not arguing that it doesn't need to be improved, I think it does, but it's still way better than the matchmaker used to be. 3 tiers was the normal matchmaking spread. I've been fighting tier 5 tanks in this battle. This was standard matchmaking back then. Now, it's not an issue for me because I'm a top tier medium, but some of those tier 5s, the KVs, they have to fight Tiger 2s. They have to fight IS-3s. Can you imagine if this matchmaker was still around in World of Tanks today? Imagine if you could regularly expect to have to face IS-3s and Object 252 defenders, and you're at a KV-1. And the only way you can get any premium ammunition, not that it would help you against an Object 252, but the only way you could get your hands on any premium ammunition was by spending money. And let's not forget, light tier matchmaking was even worse. Light tanks didn't go beyond tier 5, and a tier 5 light tank was a scout in tier 10 games. And bearing all this in mind, I'm going through the comments of my recent World of Tanks videos, and the overwhelming sentiment appears to be that the game is in the toilet, and it's worse than it's ever been. I mean, really? I don't know about that. I mean, yeah, sure. There are several things about World of Tanks that could stand to be improved, and hopefully they will be. Personally, I'd like to see matchmaking limited to no more than 1 tier in either direction, and if that was the case, there wouldn't be the need for as much premium ammunition because, well, you'd never have to fight anything that was more than 1 tier higher than you, unless you were in a failed platoon, but, well, then it would be your own fault. Personally, I can't see that happening anytime soon. I think premium ammunition is the cornerstone of the World of Tanks economy as far as wargaming is concerned, but the game has improved over the course of the last 6 years, either way. You have to understand where this game was 6 years ago, and how much better it has definitely gotten. And hopefully, it's going to continue to do so. Hopefully, without it taking another 6 years. Actually, that's a question. Do you think this game's still going to be around 6 years from now? I realise most people's gut reaction is going to be to say, no, the game's dying. It's in a worse state than it's ever been. They'll be surprised if it lasts another year, but nobody expected this game to last 6 years 6 years ago, and it doesn't seem to be showing any signs of slowing down. If you go back to the forums, well, you can't, but I can remember 6 years ago going back to the forums, and they hadn't really changed. It was the same people complaining about the same things, predicting the same doom and gloom. This game's dead, people are leaving it in droves, wargaming doesn't care, and so on and so on and so on. You know, it's funny how people's complaints never really change. I can remember when I was in the Navy, I was attending a lecture. I can't remember why, but it was a lecture from the Naval Recruiting and Training Agency. So we're all sitting down in this lecture theatre and we're watching a presentation which mostly consisted of a bunch of quotes from senior ratings, petty officers and chief petty officers, who were responsible for basic training at new entry training establishments. And the quotes were all pretty much the same. These guys were all basically complaining about the standard of the new recruits that were coming through for training, and they were saying things like, these kids have got no respect for authority, it's completely different from my generation, they don't take orders, they won't take discipline. These kids today, you know, exactly the sort of complaints that you'd expect. Anyway, the lecturer, who was a commander from the Naval Training Agency, paused the presentation and then said, anybody in the lecture theatre who agrees with the sentiments expressed by these senior rates about people coming through training today, raise your hand. And the majority of people in the lecture theatre put their hand up, myself included. And then he told us all to put our hands down, and then he revealed that these were not quotes from petty officers and chief petty officers responsible for training today's new entry recruits. These were quotes from senior rates responsible for training the recruits of the 1950s. These were men who'd served throughout World War II and were now responsible for training a new generation of soldiers, sailors and airmen. A new generation of soldiers, sailors and airmen who would go on to fight in the Korean War. Now, I realise the Korean War is something of a forgotten conflict. It's nowhere near as popular in film, TV, or literature as Vietnam or World War II, but I have actually read quite extensively on the subject of the Korean War. And while I have absolutely no doubt that the World War II generation, who were responsible for the basic training of the Korean War generation, I have no doubt that they were absolutely sincere in their belief that the standard of trainees coming through training was appallingly low compared to their generation. I'm sure that they believed that. At the same time, that 1950s generation produced young men who would go on to join the 1st Battalion of the Gloucester Regiment, who, during the Battle of the Imjin River, 650 men would hold out for 3 days against 10,000 Chinese. And you know what? I have absolutely no doubt that the 150 survivors of the 650 men in that Gloucester Regiment would later go on to be responsible for training yet another generation of young men and, by that time, young women coming through basic training for the armed forces, and they would have exactly the same thing to say about them. And I know for a fact that when I was going through basic training in the late 1980s, my instructors, who fought in the Falklands, were saying exactly the same thing about me. And my generation went on to fight in the First and Second Gulf Wars. And we seem to do okay. I guess the point of the story is that it's perfectly normal for people to complain about what they have and keep looking back in the past through rose-tinted glasses and just assuming that things were automatically better back then. But the reality is, most of the time, not an awful lot has actually changed. And anything that has changed has usually changed for the better. I mean, that's not always the case. I can remember when I was growing up, it was perfectly possible for a working man to work 5 days a week and earn enough money to be able to buy a house and take his family on holiday once a year. And his wife wouldn't have to work. And those days are long gone. These days, a lot of people work 6 days a week. You work on a contract rather than being employed full-time by your employer, purely and simply because employers don't have to pay contract workers medical or health insurance. Also, if you're working on a contract, it's a lot easier for your employer to just get rid of you if they don't like you for whatever reason. They can just refuse to renew your contract rather than going through the potentially expensive process of firing you, which may result in some form of employment termination compensation. And because you're working on a contract, which isn't necessarily going to be renewed, you don't know for sure whether or not you're actually going to have a job this time next year. Both members of the household tend to have to work, and yet somehow you don't seem to be pulling in enough money to be able to reliably afford a mortgage for a house, and you certainly can't afford to be going on expensive foreign holidays every year. Oh yes, and let's not forget, since your pension fund got invested in subprime mortgages by greedy corporate bankers several years ago, which blew the bottom out of the international finance market, your pension fund is now currently worth the price of a weekend in Bognor Regis. So you're probably going to have to continue working into your 70s, and even then you're probably still going to end up on the streets at the age of 72 because, well, let's face it, you're working on a contract. And you're 72. You're too old and crap to work reliably, so you're going to get sacked, and then God knows what's going to happen to you. So yeah, I suppose in some ways things probably were a bit better in the past. But not World of Tanks. World of Tanks has definitely improved. It could be better, but it's definitely improved. And on that positive note, that's just about it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Don't forget, we got Tankfest this weekend. As usual, I do expect and look forward to meeting as many of you as possible on both the Saturday and the Sunday at the Tank Museum. And there is not going to be an episode of Mingles with Jingles next week, because I'm going to be absolutely exhausted after being at the Tank Museum all day on Sunday, and I'm just not going to be in any mood to travel all the way home and then sit down and start to do an episode of Mingles with Jingles. So I'm taking next Monday off, but normal service will resume on Tuesday. And that is it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I do hope those of you who are going to Tankfest are going to have a fantastic time there. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.